Emergivac Sharia, South Africa's first and only fully Sharia-compliant family medical takaful and wellness product, wishes all listeners Ramadan Kareem. Download the Emergivac app today and get free immediate access to the Emergivac Sharia collection of du'as, hadith, Quran, and much more. Welcome back to News and Views with me, Zahira Bam Ismail. We will now be chatting to an analyst, an activist, a writer, a name exceptionally well known to all of us in the community, Ayesha Kajee. Ayesha, assalamu alaikum and welcome to the studios.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much, Sahira.
Ayesha, yesterday we saw a resolution adopted by the UN Security Council demanding an immediate ceasefire in Gaza for the month of Ramadan and the immediate unconditional release of all hostages, with 14 voting in favor, 0 against, and 1 abstaining. I think this has opened up so many questions and so many discussions. So I'm going to go right into it with you. Ayesha, we're sitting here, finally, we're seeing the US having a change. Benjamin Netanyahu said if they have a change in principled position, I don't know what principled position it was before, but he said if they have a change in principled position, he won't send his delegation any longer to the States, which we have seen him revoking that and pulling that back. Why all of a sudden this change from what we've been recurrently seeing in all these days?
Well, what we've been seeing all these days in the United Nations Security Council is that the US has consistently been using its veto to veto a ceasefire resolution. Now, some of the mainstream media may contest that. They may say that just last week, Russia and China vetoed a ceasefire resolution. But quite honestly, Zahira, that resolution last week was not a
Yes.
ceasefire resolution. It was a joke. It was
Yes.
actually an insult to the Palestinian people who are currently, enduring a genocide in Gaza and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank at the least.
Mm. So now all of a sudden with this change of at least an abstention in it, I know that there was probably, or let me ask you, was there probably a preemptive plan had the United States tried to veto again at yesterday's resolution?
Well, on the sidelines of the United Nations Security Council, advisors to some of the ambassadors in that Security Council, people close to the Palestinian envoy to the UN, were all saying that there was going to be a really fierce debate, if nothing else, to really in some way, shape, or form either pressure the US or bypass the US. But apart from what's happening within the United Nations Security Council itself and in the United Nations more broadly, and the pressure indeed for reform of the Security Council, there is also domestic imperative that must have at least played a partial role in this change of tone by the Biden administration, given that it is an election year and these protests across the United States have been widespread and are becoming even more so. So there are both international geopolitical imperatives for this change in tone. I don't really think it's a change in attitude, it's just a change in tone by the US, as well as domestic political imperatives. And so the US has abstained from this. They did push very hard to remove the inclusion of the word permanent ceasefire, and that has now been replaced with a lasting, sustained ceasefire. The language is important, Zahira, even though it may seem to be the same thing, it's not. And the question then arises, so is the US envisaging this to be a temporary thing? And will it then, once the hostages, so-called hostages, on the one side are released, is it then going to support an invasion of Rafah and a further extension of this genocide in Gaza and a continuation of the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank and East Jerusalem? Because one must remember that this attack, this aggression, I refuse to call it a war, it is not two-sided. This aggression has been made possible by both the financing of the United States as well as it's directly arming the Israeli regime.
Absolutely. And I think, as you rightly mentioned, this is electioneering PR at its best. And not only that, I think it also does stand as to where they stand with people taking them to the ICJ and the ICC and being complicit in this genocide. And I think having insight to be able to look at that is actually much needed at this point. Aisha, you mentioned the wording of this resolution is highly important. What we've seen is it's 2 weeks that they're calling for. At which point do we say now it's enough? We need something sustainable. We need something lasting, because this cannot be happening every single time we look back at the news. Every few years, there's a complete destruction of infrastructure, of lives, and it's blatant and it's brutal and it's predictable. We're seeing it way too often. So is this a 2 week time period, and then where to from there?
Well, I think that's the question the international community, and particularly the United Nations, including the Security Council, needs to be asking. Is this really going to be a 2 week ceasefire that then sees a resumption in the aggression by the apartheid Israeli regime? Or is there going to be real meat to this? Yes, we all welcome the fact that there's a ceasefire at all. We know that people are starving, enforced starvation in the north, and that hundreds of people are dying every week. We're now standing at a casualty rate of over 32,000 known casualties, with many others possibly still buried under rubble, missing, etc. So this is nothing short of a genocide. The UN itself has said this. They've said that 3 of the 5 conditions of genocide have likely been met. And of course, the world's highest court, the ICJ, has said that there's plausibly a genocide. They said this 2 months ago in happening in Gaza. So given all of that, there really ought to be more pressure for a sustained, permanent, I won't say lasting, I'll say permanent ceasefire, because lasting implies that, well, it could last for days, weeks, months, even years, but that it may not necessarily be permanent forever. And that's a worrying, nuance in the language. The other small victory is that the US did not succeed in making this temporary ceasefire conditional upon the release of hostages. And then again, one must also ask the question, when we talk about hostages in the mainstream media, that's largely designated as Israeli citizens being held hostage by Hamas, most of them from the October 7th Operation Al-Aqsa flood. Those are about 130 people. What about, on the other hand, Zahira, the more than 7,000 hostages currently being held by Israel? 7,000 since the beginning of this attack. Since the beginning of October, more than 7,000 people have been imprisoned, rounded up, arrested, and are being held hostage, essentially. It's the same thing, is it not? Over and above that, prior to October last year, there were thousands of Palestinians held in so-called administrative detention in Israeli jails. Are those not hostages as well? And that includes several hundred children. So in any mention of hostages being returned, it must be two-sided, not one. And currently, of course, Hamas and Egypt and Qatar are sitting down to try and broker some form of a hostage exchange. But what I'm saying is the UN resolution on the hostage aspect is somewhat vague. Yes, it is excellent that the ceasefire is not dependent on the hostage release or vice versa, but that hostage exchange must be equitable. It must actually release some of those, at least some of those, perhaps inshallah most of those currently being held hostage by Israel as well.
Absolutely. And I think, Aisha, this is what most people end up missing is they think that there's only hostages on the one side. The rest have been lawfully arrested. And the truth of it is many have been kept in prison, very much like in the apartheid days, with absolutely no trial, with absolutely no convictions. So it is actually hostage taking on the other side. And like you rightfully mentioned, there are a number of children that are sitting in prisons that are being held hostage on the Israeli side. So that exchange of the prisoners has to be double-sided. It cannot just be on a one-sided thing. Aisha, you just mentioned also with regards to since the ICJ ruling, we were looking at the Gaza numbers that we receive, and on day 60, which is where we're at now since the ICJ ruling, just in one day, the stats have moved up with 107 already killed just in one day. And we
In
know
one.
that there was fighting already again this morning that took
Mhm.
place. If this fighting again this morning that took place when we've just had a calling for an immediate ceasefire, my question to you is, how do you actually end up enforcing this from the UN Security Council? If you're now passing it and rhetoric and words are one thing, how do we ensure that Netanyahu actually abides by this, that soldiers are pulled out and this is stopped?
Well, I'm very, very glad you asked that, Zahira. Firstly, in this resolution, the thing that's missing and that South Africa asked for way back in January is a complete military withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. Okay, so the question arises then, what are we going to see in terms of a ceasefire? We're going to see a halting, but all those Israeli troops remaining in Gaza. Are we going to see the US continue to try and build its proposed pier? But in terms of what the UN Security Council can do, there are several things. And I believe this is what the US ambassador to the UN was referring to when she called this resolution non binding. I think she was trying to find some wiggle room. But
Mm,
alas for the US and its hugest ally in this matter, Israel, there isn't any wiggle room. A UN Security Council is legally binding, which means, Zahira, that if Israel does not comply, and as you've so rightly said, already they are not complying. 130 odd people have been killed almost overnight. We saw last night as worshippers left Al Aqsa Masjid, they were subjected to harassment, beating, and arrest by the occupation forces, both police forces and defense forces, or so called defense forces, as well as at the Hatta, Damascus, and Al Khalili gates of the old city of Jerusalem. There were clashes with security forces. So we're already seeing that Israel is probably signaling that it's unlikely to actually comply with this resolution. I will be very surprised, though very relieved, if it does. If it does not comply, the UN Security Council can then basically enact a Chapter 7 intervention. Now, under Chapter 7 of the UN resolutions, of the UN Convention, sorry, under Chapter 7, there are several things that the UN can then bring into place. One of them is quite excruciating and tough sanctions on the state that does not comply. And remember, the Israel is currently a state in the United Nations. It's been recognized by the United Nations since
mm,
inception. Right? So the UN could bring in the Chapter 7 resolution and then basically apply sanctions and stringent sanctions on Israel, economic, travel, etc. So that will impact Israel very, very badly. The trade sanctions will impact Israel badly in terms of, Israel has long been an exporter of arms and surveillance
mm,
equipment and defense equipment that it tests on the Palestinians and then exports to the rest of the world as battle tested. That's a
mm,
major source of Israeli income. So sanctions would impact things like that. Trade, as I said, travel, and of course, just general sanctions on the country. The other thing that Chapter 7 does allow for is a military intervention. In other words, a show of force to
mm,
ensure that this UN Security Council is enacted, that the ceasefire is enacted. This is, in fact, to some extent, what our own Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor has been calling for. That that the most powerful nations of the world should
mm,
actually use their force and their friendship, many of them, with Israel to allow the aid in. So, under Chapter 7, that could happen, that a use of force, aid to allow aid in and to maintain the ceasefire could happen. Now, of course, this is unlikely to pass with the US still having a veto. And
mm,
that is why the US has tried to find this wiggle room by its ambassador to the UN saying, oh, it's a non binding resolution. Sorry, Every
It's
single
binding.
expert that I've spoken to, and I spoke to one yesterday, and I've seen the opinions of others in writing, and I'm due to speak to another one this afternoon. Every single expert agrees that this is a binding resolution. So some of Israel's worst nightmares might well be on the table in the very near future.
So that's my question to you as a layperson from the outside is how soon is the very near future? Because for many of us, this is going on way too long. It's 170 days, way too long than it should have ever been. We're watching this carnage, this genocide, this domicide going on relentlessly and almost with an arrogance of, I don't care what anyone says, I'll continue to do it and I will destroy it until there's nothing left. And there's a huge mention of Rafah with 1.4 million people in Rafah with absolutely nowhere to go. And yet this relentless pursuit to say, I won't stop at it. So how soon do these sanctions get put in? Because the last thing we need to watch is another meeting after another meeting after another council after another resolution, and then perhaps sanctions being put into place.
Again, that's a difficult one to answer, but I would assume, given the near unanimous vote for calling for a ceasefire by the other members of the United Nations Security Council, I would estimate within 2-3 weeks at the most, if Israel is not complying, I think we're going to see Chapter 7 intervention. And on
Yes.
that note, I think that Israel will continue to harass, torture, and ethnically cleanse people in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. They may stop at least the most egregious of their genocidal activities in Gaza. But as long as their troops and their armaments are in the Gaza Strip and have not moved out of it,
Mm.
that is going to be cause for severe concern, particularly given this road they seem to be intent on building through Gaza. And of course, also cause for concern is the so-called pier that the US wants to build.
Yes.
But let us wait and see. Um,
And we'll
Hopefully, Hamas
absolutely.
will insist on a complete military withdrawal, or at least a partial military withdrawal from Gaza. We're going to have to wait and see how that pans out and how quickly that can pan out. But of course, in terms of lives saved and lives lost, the UN envoy. The envoy to the UN for Palestine yesterday said it was a very belated ceasefire, and he actually apologized to those people whose lives were lost, those people who have been injured, etc., because that could have been prevented had this resolution
Yes.
come sooner. So we hope sooner rather
Absolutely.
than later, inshallah.
Inshallah. Aisha, I know there's so many more questions, especially you've brought up on the pier, but we are running short on time. Very quickly, as my last question to you. In our previous interviews with Minister Naledi Pandor, she said an ideal thing would be a two-state solution. How would that even be possible here when we've seen a genocide, we've seen a domicide, we've seen an entire annihilation of infrastructure, of every single thing that people own, that they have? There's literally, we know, for example, absolutely zero bakeries that are left there. There's a complete destruction of any kind of form of land that people would be able to rebuild on. And we're seeing this not just in Gaza, we're starting to see it on the West Bank as well. How would that even be possible? And what are your views of that going forward?
Well, Zahra, I've taught a postgraduate course at WITS on the politics of genocide. And one of the things that invariably accompany the killing of people, the wholesale slaughter and murder of people, is an attempt to erase that they ever actually existed. And of course,
Mm,
that is what Israel was trying to do in this wholesale destruction, trying to ensure that people can't go back to their homes, that simple things like their memories captured in things like photographs and the certificates and books and little artifacts and recipes, etc., are erased. And this
mm,
attempt at erasure is so devastating that really a two-state solution currently would just not be possible. The 1967 borders, under which a two-state solution was perhaps remotely possible, those borders have been so infringed upon by the more than 700 settlements in the West Bank on land that, according to the 1967 Oslo Accords, would be reserved for a Palestinian state. The fact that so many neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, neighborhoods like Sheikh Jarrah, have been infringed upon. This basically says that any hope of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital, as part of a two-state solution, is perhaps now a pipe dream. And if a two-state solution were to come into being, we would have constant clashes between the so-called settlers and the people, the Palestinian people, wanting to rightfully return to the homes that have been the homes of their families for generations, the homes to which they hold keys. So, really, at
Absolutely.
this point, given the erosion of the 1967 borders, a two-state solution is not a viable, sustainable, long-term solution. We're going to have to look elsewhere.
Ayesha Kajee, analyst, activist, and writer, shukran for joining us for this segment on Salam Media. Your news and your views are definitely appreciated and welcomed here. Shukran. Assalamu alaikum. Please stay tuned while we go for this ad break. We'll be back with the rest of our show.
South Africa has called for a ceasefire for many, many weeks, and we're very pleased that at last the Security Council has agreed on a resolution calling for a ceasefire for a long-term period during this month of Ramadan, but also proposing that work should begin toward a permanent ceasefire. I think this is a welcome resolution, and now the ball is in the court of the Security Council, because they'll be tested as to their ability to ensure adherence to the resolution. But on having agreed a resolution, having tabled it and passed by the majority of the members, this is certainly an encouraging step.